Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. Welcome to the webinar today, really focused on simulating the top 10 attack techniques within Picus. My name is Stambaugh. I'm a solutions architect here at Picus, and I'll be the host for the webinar today. So glad you guys are here with us. As I mentioned, we're going to explore how we can leverage Picus to test against the top 10 MITRE attack techniques that we're seeing being employed by adversaries today. And then using that on how to actually defend ourselves against them. So before we begin, I'll go over just a few housekeeping items. So we'll run the session for about 30 minutes. I'll look to save some time for some Q&A at the end. So as we're running throughout the webinar today, do feel free to submit questions into the Q&A box. Anything related to the platform or the Red Report, which we'll cover, go ahead and pop those into the Q&A chat. Also something to note, this is going to be recorded. So if you do have to jump early, or if you've got, other folks that maybe weren't able to join today that would be interested in the content, please feel free to share the recording or pass it along once it's published. So just to get started, we will kick things off by discussing some of the research behind the topic that we're going to cover today, which is, again, the top 10 MITRE attack techniques. And we'll begin, as I mentioned, with covering where a lot of this content is coming from. And it's coming from our Picus Red Report. So if you're not at all familiar with the Red Report, I do encourage you to go download it from the website. Really interesting research coming from our Picus Labs team, where they're diving into malware and adversarial techniques that they're seeing in the wild. So this is our 6th edition yearly report that really focuses on that adversarial perspective. So just to dive in a little bit on that Red Report, which again is going to lead us into the demonstration today. This whole report is where the Picus Labs team is analyzing over 1 million different malware samples. So 15.5 different malicious actions related to those malware samples to uncover any sort of key insights related to adversarial behavior. And this year's findings, the Red Report published a comprehensive view of some of the latest trends. So this just gives us some insight into some of those key figures or those key data points from within the Red Report. And from that, we're providing some insight into those latest latest threats that we're all facing in the cybersecurity industry. So my goal today is to take a quick look at some of those key takeaways, and then we'll dive into a demo of the product within Picus to understand how we can actually make some of this actionable and start to test against some of these trends. So just again, high-level trends, what we're seeing or what our research team is seeing from that adversarial perspective is a shift on the attacker front from those more what we call smash and grab attacks. So we think, ransomware, looking to spread and compromise as many machines as possible, grab data, get it out, and hold it for ransom. We're seeing a shift from that sort of loud or noisy approach. And really a move towards what we're calling silent resiliency. So really looking to maximize dwell time within the environment from the attacker's perspective, and really fly under the radar, evade those detection or prevention controls that you might have in place. And why this is meaningful, as I'm alluding to, is we're seeing a drop in encryption and some of those loud techniques. And so our loud alerts really aren't necessarily going to be as effective when it comes to these more silent techniques. Again, maximizing dwell time, looking to not be detected. And within the Red Report, one of the things that is a really digestible piece to take away from the report are the top 10 techniques that we're seeing coming out of that research. So these are those top 10 techniques. We'll touch on how we can actually simulate against these things as we jump into the demo. But this is covering those top 10 most prevalent techniques that we're seeing adversarials employ. And a lot of it, again, is going to be related to defense evasion. So what we'll do is we'll actually dive into the demo, because one of the benefits of not just the Picus Labs team performing this research, but also in tandem with the Picus platform, is we make this actionable. So the Picus Labs team actually builds threat templates within the platform to allow you to simulate these different TTPs or APT groups, malware, different strains that we can test against the environment. All things that you'll see touched on in the report, we can start to dive into within the platform. So we'll go ahead and dive into the demo portion of things. So I'll go ahead and share out my screen. And for those that maybe are seeing Picus for the first time, Picus is a security control validation platform. And that's really what we're going to focus on today. It's really, I should say, a CTEM platform. So looking at overall adversarial exposure and validating exposure. But today we're going to hone in on the security control validation piece of things and how we can leverage that research within the Red Report and make it actionable against our tools and controls to ensure that we are protected against those really pervasive techniques. So first thing, as we dive into the security control validation component of the platform, there's a couple of concepts that I think are meaningful to highlight or to touch on. And that's really the concepts of prevention versus detection. You're going to see this quite a bit throughout the platform. And when we talk about prevention in the context of Picus, really what we mean is how well are your controls preventing or blocking the actions related to adversarial behavior. When we talk about detection, what we're really saying is how well are your controls giving you visibility into those actions, to those behaviors? Are there logs being generated? Are there alerts being generated from some of that behavior? And as you're seeing, or as you may have noticed, I've really drilled into some of the simulations that we've run related to that Red Report. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But those overall prevention versus detection concepts are going to be really meaningful as we dive into the platform. Now, just to give a quick insight into how Picus is going to function, we're going to leverage what we call simulation agents to actually run the adversarial actions, run the threats within the environment. So we can cover various operating systems, Windows, Linux, Mac, Kubernetes, testing up in Azure as well. But these are what are going to allow you to start to test from that adversarial perspective. And they're going to give us insight into how successful was an action. Additionally, we'll be able to integrate, or Picus will be able to integrate within the tech stack in your environment. So whether you're using, as you see here, various solutions like CrowdStrike or SentinelOne for EDR, maybe you're leveraging Splunk or IBM QRadar for SIEM, we're going to tie into those technologies to add additional context around exactly how your controls responded to a particular behavior. So that's just really setting the stage for what we're going to see as we jump into the platform. But where I want to go first, right, is really talking about some of the threat templates. So just in general, the Picus Labs team is going to continuously curate content really targeted at maybe your specific industry, specific region. So I see, I saw some folks in the chat from Brazil, right? So if you're in Brazil or South America, maybe you're in financial services, you'll see content that's really tailored to you as an organization, as well as just general threat templates that they'll create based off of what they're seeing in the wild or what they're seeing out in the industry, such as new and emerging threats. Now, specifically, topic of conversation today is going to be that Picus Red Report. And so you'll see some templates here under the suggested by Picus Labs. You'll see some reports that are really tailored to that Red Report content, 2026 specifically. And you'll see other templates based off of some previous reports that we've published in the past. But today we're really focused on that new intel that we got from the Red Report in 2026. And so you'll see the top 10 techniques. We can dive into that, understand what are those threats that are related to the top 10. So these are all of those specific actions that we're seeing attackers leverage, or specific TTPs that we're seeing attackers leverage to do some of that or establish some of that silent resiliency within the environment. So some process injection, command and scripting interpreter, micro emulation. These are the various actions that are being pulled from that research that the Picus Labs team did. And we can use this to go ahead and actually simulate against our environment right away. So I can hop in here and say, I want to go ahead and run a simulation, maybe against my Denver environment. So I can queue that up, actually go ahead and just instantly run this, select, which tools I want to enrich that data, which controls maybe are deployed to this system so I can better understand how they're responding to this behavior, and I can kick off that simulation. Hopping back into the threat templates, that of course was the top 10, but there's going to be other Red Report templates where we can focus maybe more on some of the endpoint actions, or if we really want to focus on the malware that is really prevalent from that Red Report research. There's going to be various templates that we can run to understand how are our tools and controls actually responding. So things like TinkyWiki malware dropper or Xloader malware dropper. We can start to test this against our network controls to understand, is it possible to infiltrate this malware or download malware within the environment? Now, while that simulation that I just queued up runs, I've actually went ahead and pre-run a simulation with the top 10 actions or top 10 techniques, so we can take a look and see how this environment is actually responding to those threats. And as we dive into a simulation, a couple of things to note: that prevention versus detection concept is here again, right? So you will see that prevention versus detection, and this is really specific to this threat, or to this simulation, I should say. Now, when we talk about a simulation within Picus, a simulation is really a compilation of threats that you've chosen to run. In this case, just referencing back to the template that we ran, we're focusing on the top 10 techniques coming out of that red report from the Picus Labs team. So we'll see those threats listed here, and we can see at a high level how well are our controls responding to those threats. And from a prevention perspective, we have some work to do, right? We have a 65% prevention score when it comes to actually actively stopping or preventing these threats from being able to occur. And that 65% is coming from a compilation of, how many of these threats were blocked versus not blocked, which, none of them were holistically blocked. So that's certainly something we'd want to dig into. And then how many of those attacker objectives were achieved versus unachieved. So a lot that were unachieved, but many that also were achieved, leading to the overall threats not being blocked. Now, on the detection front, on that visibility side of things, the logging, the SIEM, we're at a 46% in terms of detection, right? Also, maybe not strong. Some areas that we can work to strengthen in terms of that visibility and maybe alerting that goes along with that. And we can see, 13 of those threats were logged versus 3 that were not, and only 2 were alerted on versus 14 that, of course, as we're seeing, were not alerted on. And we can then start to, from here, dig into this a little bit further. So if we take a look at the threats themselves, we can at a glance see, was this something that was blocked? Was it detected? And really a lot of these, or all of these at some point were not blocked. At some point in the process, they were not blocked by our endpoint controls. And we can dive a little bit deeper. So if we wanted to hop into process injection, for example, one of the different techniques for process injection, we can start to see at a more granular level how both CrowdStrike as well as Splunk responded to these different actions. And within the threat, you'll have what we call the attacker objectives and the actual actions themselves. So when we talk about attacker objectives, that's really what the attacker is looking to achieve or accomplish. So you'll see things, as you see here, like defense evasion. This is really heavily focused around defense evasion. You may also see objectives related to lateral movement or discovery, just depending on the different types of threats that you're running. The actions, on the other hand, are the thing that Picus, or the thing that the attacker will actually do to accomplish that objective. And as I mentioned, we can see at a glance how well our controls are actually responding to those threats or to those actions. And so initially, we can see here, right, this first action, that this execute the ransom EXX tool, we can see that not only was it not blocked, it was alerted on, but we don't see any logging from CrowdStrike. If we look at this from a Splunk perspective, we don't see any sort of blocking, but we do see some logs being generated on the Splunk front, and no alerts though, right? So this is giving us just at a glance insight into how our controls actually responded. Now I can dig even further into this. I can look at more of the details related to this action. So this is going to give me, if I dive into the action, this is going to give me some insight into the different TTPs that are associated with this action, the actual timeline for the attack or for the event. And then from here, I can drill even further into things like the execution details. And when we talk about execution details, we like to break these up into the play processes and the rewind processes. The play processes are going to be those things that the play processes will be those things that Picus actually did, or maybe the payloads or the commands that were executed to perform this particular action. So we can see the evidence of exactly, again, what Picus actually did. Any terminal output, if relevant, we can see or have insight into here. So any different processes or any different, I should say, payloads or commands that Picus has run, you're going to have that insight. Additionally, when we talk about the rewind processes, this is going to be Picus returning the machine back to that known good state. So if anything is altered or created or changed in the process of those play processes, we're also going to have a corresponding rewind process to, again, ensure everything is returned back to that known good state. Now, digging into how our controls responded, this is where we can start to dive into just what was generated from our different controls. So from a CrowdStrike perspective, we do see that there were quite a few alerts being generated. So that is good. We didn't see any blocking, which maybe we would like to see CrowdStrike blocking this action. But we do see some alerts that were generated. On the Splunk front, we see a whole slew of different sysmon, process creation, registry value logs that were generated. And we could certainly dive in if we wanted to look in more into the raw logs. We could click into any one of these logs and start to drill down even further. But now that we understand this particular action was not blocked, it was detected, right? We do see some alerting from CrowdStrike, and we do see some logging from Splunk. But if this was, something that maybe wasn't being logged or wasn't being alerted on, as is the case of no alert within Splunk, this is where we can start to dive into mitigation. And mitigation is a big piece of the other half of Picus, of security control validation. So the first piece is just performing the simulations right off the get-go, right? That's sort of the first step. Let's get the lay of the land and understand how our controls are actually responding. The second piece is making that actionable, being able to make improvements in your tool set to ensure that if it is something that's not being blocked or detected, it will be in the future. So this is where we get into mitigation, and Picus will provide higher level generic mitigation like you're seeing here related to both detection and prevention. But where we get more specific is going to be through the vendor-based detection. So for this particular action, no vendor-based necessarily content here, but what we can do is we can actually dive into the planner. So we can drill into different detection content related to each individual action. But where I think things are more meaningful, or where we can make them more meaningful, more actionable, is instead of drilling into each individual action, we can start to create goals around improvement. So I'll hop into my planner here. And this allows me to take, let me take a step back before we dive into the planner, but this allows me to take all of this content in the detection and prevention center and make it actionable. So if we dive just quickly into detection content, this is going to be our vendor-based detection content. And we saw, in that simulation, CrowdStrike being the EDR that was in use. So if we want to really focus on improving prevention and really focus on CrowdStrike rules that we can implement, this is going to show me all of the rules that are recommended by Picus based on the simulations that we've actually run. So this library set of detections is very much focused on the outcomes of your simulation. So the rule suggestions based on areas that Picus has seen, maybe prevention not being as strong. Same thing on the SIEM side. If we want to focus on Splunk rules, this is going to give me all of the Splunk rules that are recommended based on the simulations that I've run in my unique environment. Now, again, moving over into the prevention side, on maybe the network side of things, we can also start to implement specific signatures. So let's say we're using Palo Alto as our firewall. This is going to give me insight into the signatures that I can implement within Palo Alto to ensure that this is something that is being prevented from a network perspective. So the Prevention and Detection Center is going to give you that very vendor-specific guidance on how to tighten up or strengthen the controls that are in place that are designed to prevent or at least detect some of these actions. Now, hopping back into the planner, this is where I can start to parse out that data into what we call goals, right? We can plan out different goals, and you can see some pre-built goals here related to things like prevention gaps, improving prevention gaps, areas where we're maybe not doing a great job on preventing different threats or actions related to threats, or even detection gaps. But what I've done here today is I actually created a custom goal specific to the Red Report, really pulling in those findings from those simulations that I ran. And these are all of the threats and the detection and mitigation guidance specific to the threats that we actually ran. So you'll see some of the top 10 techniques in here, as well as some of the network, more malware related threats that we ran in another template. But this is going to allow me to start to really focus on shoring up areas where there's gaps related to these threats. So application layer protocol microemulation, this was one of the top 10 techniques. And it is a fairly severe finding, and I can drill into that finding. I can see the instances where we ran this particular threat and the actions related, and exactly, again, how our control responded, which was not blocked and was not alerted on. So now I can go into the mitigation content that's curated for these threats or for these actions, and I can dig a little bit deeper, right? So query DNS for command and control server using NSLOOKUP. I can now drill in and say, okay, I want to focus on CrowdStrike, right? And this is going to give me insight into the exact IOA query that I can implement to ensure that this is something that is both prevented and detected and maybe alerted on by CrowdStrike. And because Picus has really tight integrations with those vendors, we can actually deploy those queries directly to the technology. So we're looking at CrowdStrike, for example, here. We can also look at it from that SIEM, the Splunk perspective, where we can deploy this query directly to Splunk, or as we saw before, CrowdStrike. And what this allows the team to do is get that query directly into the tool where it needs to be implemented. It doesn't automatically go live, but it does give the SOC team or the detection engineering team the ability to start to play with it, fine tune it, test it, make sure it is operating the way that you would expect before pushing it out to a live detection. So you'll always have that vendor-based mitigation, both from a prevention and a detection perspective built into the platform. Now, what we can do here, right, is actually also pull reports. So the planner here gives us the ability to start to parse out the data and really focus on the mitigation and the prevention side of things, but we can also pull reports on any of this data. And so as I mentioned, I created this Red Report dashboard here showing me exactly how I'm doing from a prevention and detection perspective on all of the Red Report related simulations that I've run. So I can generate a report from here that's going to be very specific to that content if I needed to share it out and really show sort of that baseline of where we sit. And then as we maybe run those templates and we start to improve or implement some of the detection rules and the queries that are suggested, we might see those prevention and detection results increase over time. And so the report would allow you to start to pull from the baseline, right? Just baselining here where we're at 34% prevention versus 53% on detection. If we were to make some changes and run this again next week or even the next day, this report would allow you to start to reflect some of those trends over time. But we can see at a quick view how we're doing from a prevention perspective specific to the Red Report threats and how we're doing from that detection perspective. And if we do run this over time, we can start to see some of those trends and we can also start to benchmark, right? So this is going to allow us to see how we stack up against not only, just overall Picus customers, but also Picus customers or Picus customers in a particular region. So my demo region is set in Italy. So what we're looking at here is Southern Europe. But if we were in the United States, or if we were in South America, we would have that reflected, that benchmarking reflected related to our specific region. Additionally, we also see that benchmarking in relation to the industry. So if you're in financial services or maybe healthcare, utilities, whatever that industry may be, you can start to get an understanding of how are we stacking up against other customers in that same vertical. And the rest of this report will go into a breakout of that detection versus prevention based on the different attack type modules that we've actually run, as well as getting into some of the, if I scroll down just a bit here, getting into the MITRE mapping as well. So if we wanted to understand how are we stacking up when it comes to MITRE, so this is going to go over some of the detection analytics, but if we get into things like attacker objectives, we then move into the MITRE overview. So this is going to show us how we stack up against the MITRE attack framework when it comes to prevention versus detection. So, we are only preventing 29 out of the 47 techniques that were tested, so 55% on the defense evasion tactic, whereas on the detection front, doing a little bit better, 60% of those techniques we are actually detecting. Versus persistence, right? Maybe this is an area where we need to initially focus is from a prevention standpoint, there's some work to do to ensure that those persistence techniques are actually being prevented by my endpoint controls. Now, I did want to make sure that we save some time for any sorts of questions. So I'll pause the demo here and pivot over to the Q&A if there are any questions in particular related to the demo, the platform, or the Red Report as a whole. I'm happy to address those. And as if anyone's working on adding in any questions to that Q&A chat, just know that We also are happy to, the Picus team here is happy to, if we want a more in-depth discussion on the platform, maybe as a whole, or diving into anything in particular for a deeper discussion, we're happy to set up a more individual deep dive into the platform. So certainly not the only opportunity to ask questions or get a glimpse into the platform. Yeah, and so I'm looking at the chat now. So Juan asks how his environment is affected during simulation. So it's a really good question. When we talk about these simulations, we're not running agents across the entire production environment. Really, the goal of Picus is to have a representative system in the environment that we can run those simulations against that represents maybe the different types of control figurations that you have, different tool sets that you might be using. And so we're not touching the production systems. So there is no negative impact or harm to any of your production or live environment. And we're looking to test and understand how controls are responding. So a sample system allows Picus to do that. And certainly I think this is something that you could dive a little bit deeper into and maybe a deeper demo as well. So another question, which attacks do you believe will be more rampant or frequent this year? Based on that Red Report, if you haven't reviewed it yet, I highly recommend it. But if we hop over here, I'll share this slide out once more. The top 10 most prevalent MITRE attack techniques. I think these are the techniques that we're going to see happening. So when it comes to attacks in general, we're going to see more persistence, more defense evasion attacks become a lot more rampant or a lot more frequent as we're seeing the shift of attackers looking to maximize their dwell time. So they're really aiming to not get caught. So we're going to see a lot more focus on techniques related to that defense evasion, related to persistence within the environment, so they can sort of live off the land, gather intel slowly, and not make a big splash. So I'm happy to hang out and answer any additional questions. Certainly, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a webinar that has been recorded. So if there are other folks from your teams that would be interested in diving a little bit deeper into this particular topic, this will be available to share out with them. But I do appreciate everybody's time today. I'll hang out here for a little bit and answer any additional questions that might come through. Otherwise, we do really appreciate the time and appreciate the interest in diving a little bit deeper into that Red Report and some of those findings and how we use Picus to address some of the research coming out of that report. I see some questions in the regular chat here. One moment. What if I have an XDR service, use entire, how you simulate? Yeah, so where we're typically going to integrate is with the EDR as well as the SIEM. So when it comes to what we're able to integrate with, we can certainly dive, I think, on a deeper demo or a deeper conversation into the various integrations, but we can pull in EDR as well as SIEM. So let's say, for example, if we're using an EDR that maybe isn't integrated into the platform, we can usually pull those things in through the SIEM as well. So the SIEM is a really key piece to getting that context and getting that insight into how tools and controls respond. Yeah, and I see another question, is there a service that performs platform validation tests using AI? So yeah, so the Picus has started to develop what we call NUMI AI, and that allows us to have threats actually curated based on or using the NUMI AI, using the LLM. So what that looks like is being able to actually take a threat, maybe just using one that I mentioned in the demo, Tinky Winky, for example, plugging that in and allowing the AI to build that threat out based off of it going out and doing research on that particular threat, or if it's an APT group or a threat actor group, plugging that in, and the platform will go through and actually build a threat based off of the TTPs that are associated with that threat or threat actor group. And when it comes to things like licensing, we can certainly have a deeper conversation offline, but we do license or we do price things based off of organization size, right? So employee count, it's pretty flat rate. So there's no surprise cost associated there, but just depends on the organization and its size. So certainly a conversation we can have a little bit deeper offline for those that are interested. How often is it recommended to run simulations? I think that's really dependent on what your goals are. There's a lot of organizations that will run sort of the full simulation, maybe focusing on Windows endpoint, running every Windows endpoint simulation, and they might do that on a monthly basis, whereas they might have more frequent simulations that are maybe focused on key, like let's say the Red Report, right? If they're really focused on shoring up those top 10 techniques and ensuring that they're able to prevent and detect, then that might be something that they run on a weekly basis as they work to implement any sort of rules or detections to improve their security posture. Yeah, so good question. I see our organizations approaching emulation strategies now to be prepared or defend for future cyber attacks. I would say yes, right? That the intention here is to allow you to be prepared, right? To defend against an attacker that might be employing the same strategies or leveraging the same tactics or techniques, and give you the understanding of exactly how your controls are going to respond. So it's not necessarily to prevent, well, ideally, I mean, if, in a sense it is to prevent the adversary, but let's say they were to get into the environment, the goal here is to test controls to know that you would catch them, that your controls would not only stop them, but they would detect them and alert you. And yeah, so again, I know we're right up on the hour. I'm happy to hang out longer for any additional questions. But for those that do have to jump, I know we had 30 minutes. I appreciate the time. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you all for the kind words.